CSS is one of the other main components of modern development. CSS is not a programming language. Instead, it's a language that we use to describe how we want certain things to look. It's a language for styling things visually. Let's take a look at some CSS. In this chunk of CSS, I'm describing that I want my paragraphs to have a font size of 3 pixels. And in this chunk of CSS, I'm describing that I want my H1 headers to have the color of red. In CSS, each of these chunks or statements are referred to as a rule. A rule starts out with a selector. The selector is the area where we tell CSS what kind of HTML element should these visual styles be applied to. In this case, we want to be styling paragraphs, so we use P as the selector. The next part is where we declare what styles we actually want. This is called a declaration, and this guy here with the curly braces, or curly brackets, is called the declaration block. If you only have one declaration, then you could just keep it all on one line if you want. But as soon as you have a couple declarations, then the common practice is to space it out so it's a little bit easier to read, like this, with each declaration on a new line. Each declaration starts with a property. In this case, we want to change the font size property of all paragraphs. And we want to change it to 3 pixels. That's the size of font we want for our paragraphs. This is the property, and this is the value. They're separated by a colon, and then you end your declaration with a semicolon. That's how the browser knows that you're on to a new declaration, because it ends with a semicolon. In this CSS rule, we're saying that we want to change the styles for all H1 elements. We want to change their color to red, we want to change their font size to 70 pixels, and we want to make sure that the font is bold as well. Maybe we want to have some fun, and we want all of the paragraphs to look like H1s as well. Big, red, and bold. But we don't have to duplicate them like this because CSS allows us to use multiple selectors in a rule. So instead, we can use a comma and then a space, and we can put H1 in there as well. And now, all of these declarations will apply to paragraphs and to H1s because we've used multiple selectors separated by a comma. Let's dive in to see this in action. Back in our HTML, I've pasted this CSS inside a style element. That's how the browser knows to use this CSS. You have to put it inside a style element. Next, let's add another rule to change the paragraph color back to blue. Even though the paragraph color was initially set in this rule to red, this rule here is overriding this. That's because this rule is lower down than this one, and the last one takes precedence. If I put it up above, then this rule overrides this one, and we don't see the blue. These selectors are not very specific. We're painting with a broad brush, so to speak. What if we want only one of our paragraphs to have a certain color? Then we would use what's called a class. First, we would modify our HTML to attach a class to the paragraph that we want, and we use an attribute to do this. Now this paragraph has a class of boring. Back in our CSS, we use a dot when we want to make a selector for a class. Now we've told the browser that every element that has a class of boring should have a color of black. If I add a class of boring to my final paragraph, we'll see that it turns black as well. In this way, with classes, we can reuse a lot of declarations without having to write them multiple times. We just attach this class to any element that we want to inherit that type of visual design. Let's make another class called highlight. Notice nothing happens because we're not using this class in our HTML. Let's make this div a class of highlight. Now the background color for this div is yellow. Notice that we didn't have to write div. Instead, we used a class selector. This is more flexible because we can reuse this class selector somewhere else. Let's make our middle paragraph highlighted as well. And maybe the H1 as well. You've probably noticed that HTML elements can have multiple classes, and also a class can be attached to multiple HTML elements. Using the inspector in your browser, otherwise known as DevTools, can be a great tool for learning with CSS and HTML. You can click on this little arrow and then click on any element from the page, and you'll see it highlighted inside the inspector. Let's click on this title here. Then when we click on it, we can see all of the CSS styling information down here. And we can toggle it on and off. Toggling the color. Sometimes you'll see a change, sometimes you won't. Sometimes you'll see a change in multiple elements because you're toggling something on for a rule that affects multiple elements on the page. You can also change the color using the built-in color picker, which is cool. And you can add your own declarations as well. You can use the up and down arrow to slowly increase or decrease. As you can see, it's a great tool for discovering new types of CSS properties that you may not be familiar with. And that's CSS in a nutshell. With CSS, you make rules which consist of a selector and a block of declarations, with each declaration on its own line. The selector tells the browser what kinds of elements should be targeted by these styling choices, and the declarations are where we specify the styling choices. Your selector can be as simple as all of the paragraphs or all of the divs in the entire page, or it can be as specific as just a class that you then add to your elements in HTML. Or you can get really specific and write a selector that targets only certain types of elements that are children of another type of element that's of a certain class that is a child of another type of element, but only the last child in a list. It can get as complicated or as simple as you want, and we'll explore some of that later on.